One of the lesser-known stories in baseball's history is the formation of team names, how there came to be a consensus of how they would be handled. Of course, many people are familiar with the formation of the teams themselves and the rise of baseball fandom, but not a lot of people are familiar how there came to be this consensus of how teams would name themselves. It actually wasn't long after the formation of these teams that this debate began about how the team should be named. Originally, you just had colors. You had the Chicago Whites, the Boston Reds, the Hartford Dark Blues. Well, soon after, you had the Cincinnati Reds, and there became this debate, should we have two teams that have the same color? It soon became apparent that there were only so many colors available, and no two teams wanted to have the same name. Sure, you had the Cincinnati Reds and the Boston Reds, but they were both Reds. So the Hartford Dark Blues decided to sort of break away from this, and they became the Hartford Dark Blue Caps. And thus began the clothing trend, where you had a color and a piece of clothing. So you had the Boston Red Sox, Chicago White Sox, Hartford Dark Blue Caps, and there became a way to distinguish them beyond just their location. Well, this system kept going for a while and may have continued to this day if it wasn't for one team that actually didn't last that long, the Louisville Grays. What they decided to do was to outdo everyone, and instead of going by a clothing item, they went right to the source of the material used for clothing at that time, wool, sheep. Of course, the sheep doesn't sound like a very intimidating team name, so they went with the Rams, which of course years later became the name of an NFL team. Well, from there, Cleveland wanted to outdo Louisville, so they decided to name themselves after the top of the food chain, human beings. They named themselves the Cleveland Indians. As we know, they are still called to this day. Well, New York, they wanted to outdo Cleveland, so they named themselves out of a people that had conquered the Indians, the American settlers, and so they called themselves the Yankees. Not long after the Yankees named themselves, there was another New York team, and since they were both based in New York, they wanted to outdo the Yankees, so they called themselves the New York Giants, which is yet another team name that was adopted by the NFL years later. At this point, it almost became a game of who could outdo the next person. St. Louis was the next team that formed, and they decided to outdo the New York Giants by simply calling their team God. And shortly after the formation of God, Pittsburgh named their team the God Crushers. Following suit, Chicago decided to outdo Pittsburgh by simply naming their team the Bestsists. Unfortunately, the Bestsists wasn't really that easy on the tongue, so they just named their team the Beasts, which later became the Cubs since the name Bears was taken by the now-defunct Yonkers Bears. Now, during all this, Minnesota was still following the color format, and they were looking for a way to outdo everyone else. Now, of course, this power struggle was going back and forth, especially ending with the Bestsists there. So Minnesota decided to have their team not named after the strongest thing, but using a mascot that would catch everyone's attention. So they named their team the Minnesota Twins. Of course, this was extremely short-lived because it was considered vulgar, and soon after they simply became the Minnesota Twins instead. Now, in the midst of all this, Pittsburgh decided to sort of take the high road and rise above all this battling and outdoing, and they simply named themselves after themselves. They named themselves the Philadelphia Phillies. Well, unfortunately, this system was ruined because the former Expos decided to claim the entire nation and name themselves the Washington Nationals. More direct, however, was the attack on Oakland when Seattle simply named their team the Oakland Suxes. By 1981, Major League Baseball names became a mixture of colors, professions, clothing items, animals, fictional characters, U.S. presidents, and popular motion pictures. By the time the Toronto Fartopians came to be, the general consensus was that the team name war had gotten way out of hand and that something had to be done to protect the league's reputation. Eventually it came to pass that a committee of boring old people wrote over 500 names and put them all in a hat and each team picked a name out of the hat, which of course is why today we have team names like the Athletes, the Florida Marlins, the Milwaukee Medications, and the Nashville It's Too Cold in My Rooms. And that's how the team names that we know today came to be. Tune in next week where we'll discuss the 1939 debate over bat handle thickness.